Hi everybody, this is Katje welcoming you to my YouTube channel. This evening I thought I'd do a summery look because it's getting warm here in the desert southwest. So I wanted to wear my really girly short shorts and a cute salmon colored top with that. So let me just model that for you very quickly so that you can get the full effect. And I really like these short shorts. I got them at Forever 21. And so they fit me very nicely, and so they're comfortable, especially when it gets warm outside. So I'm really happy with this outfit, and I hope to get a lot of use out of it this summer. And what I would like to do this evening is, basically what I want to do is make good on a promise that I have advanced several times in the past, I've made several times, and that is that I want to move beyond this kind of Nietzschean critique of these other theological positions and begin to explain why that critique, which I believe to be very serious against Gelassenheit theology and Stoic theology, does not apply, does not work against the kind of Kierkegaardian view that I have described in several of my previous videos. So what I want to do is cover 4 points. And this evening I'm going to cover 2, and then hopefully next time I will cover the remaining 2. So let's get down to business and not belabor the point. Remember that one of the criticisms that this Nietzschean view makes against kind of skeptical what-if position, one of the criticisms that it makes against, in particular, Gelassenheit theology, is that there's this notion of the self that is very central to Gelassenheit theology, that's making decisions, hopefully under the influence of the holy. And so the self is kind of taken for granted in that particular theological view. And recall that Nietzsche believes that the self is not anything actually there. It's kind of a projection that arises from a certain creative combination of different elements in what Nietzsche would call the flux, which is just constant change. It's sort of like fire burning or a river flowing. All of the phenomena that occur within us psychologically as well in the world around us are kind of in flux. And it's when we get fixated upon them in a certain way and put them together that we wind up projecting not only the idea of a stable self that might make certain decisions, but also the idea of things outside of us. And we saw that Gelassenheit theology is very much involved in both of those views, those commitments, because, like I said, it takes for granted the idea of a self that tries to make decisions under the guidance of the holy. And it also requires stable things outside the self, like the trackle clocks, these things that you can return to through time and become aware of actual changes that have transpired since the last time you were in the presence of the clock, or possible changes that might transpire in the future. So the trackle clock is kind of a stable thing that we use as a measuring rod, if you will, to measure these various actual and possible changes. So Nietzsche thinks all of that is simply a projection. And remember, the basic idea is that, for example, in my own mental life, I have certain feelings in the past, and then I have other feelings later, together with the fact that I remember those earlier feelings, so that there's been some kind of change in the psychological properties or accidents in me. I also have other mental states, like certain beliefs, standing beliefs that, for example, the sun the earth revolves around the sun, or whatever it might be. And these beliefs are kind of stable. They persist through these changes in my feelings. And so what I do, according to Nietzsche, at least the critique, is that I sort of come up with the idea of something that underlies all of those things, that's stable like the beliefs, and then also, though, has these changes that it undergoes. It's almost like a mental substance or an I, and Nietzsche thinks this is a fiction. Or when we turn to the external world, with the trackle clock, or just with a thing like a tree, when we start treating it as a stable object, you know, the tree undergoes certain change. There are changes, like at one point it might be illuminated by the sunshine, at another point it might be in shadow, and then, you know, we see that there's like certain things like the tree, the bark and so forth, over a certain stretch of time is stable throughout that, even though eventually that too will change, it will wither away. And so what we do is we cobble all this together and we project, basically from our own notion of the self, we then project that onto external things so that there's this underlying material substance that's the tree in itself. And so Nietzsche thinks that all of this is simply a bunch of fictional or fictive projection. It's a bunch of fiction. Now, notice that on the Kierkegaardian view, if you'll recall, that I developed previously, there really isn't any commitment taken for granted to the self. In other words, the view doesn't start out assuming that we are given a particular self. We have to decide or come up with, using the very general human capacities of reasoning and willing under certain conditions that I have described, we have to make decisions about how we're going to respond to what God has done in Christ, in becoming incarnate in this person who suffers this innocent death with the promise of resurrection. And so, depending on how we respond to that, we will turn out to be a certain kind of self, either someone who has faith or somebody who doesn't. And so that kind of self, that kind of selfhood or commitment is not something given, it's something that we construct, and even, if you will, that we project. And so what I want to say is that on the Kierkegaardian view, it would agree with Nietzsche that the self is something that we project, and it may even be that there are no really persisting, existing material substances either. It may be even that our own bodies, the idea of a human body as something that sort of persists throughout changes in it, that's something that we project from the various changes, the biological changes, and the chemical and various other neurophysiological changes that are going on in the body. That might be a projection too. So what I want to say is that, so what? The Kierkegaardian view that I described is a kind of idealism. And idealism is the view that what really exists is basically projected by the mind. That doesn't mean that it isn't real. It just means that ultimately its reality has its basis in our psychology. It doesn't take for granted a stable self necessarily, but it takes for granted our mental life, our psychological states, and it takes the idea of some kind of persisting thing, whether that be something like a mind or a soul or a self inside of us, or some kind of external persisting thing, like a material substance like a tree or a rock. All of those things are basically projections from our own psychological mental life. So what? That doesn't mean that they aren't real. That just means that their ultimate reality has a mental basis. The Kierkegaardian view that I described would be perfectly happy to say that, well, we project both the notion of an I, or Ich in German, and the notion of an external thing in itself from that, in the way that the Nietzschean critique describes. That doesn't mean that it isn't real. That doesn't mean that it is a fiction. So for something to be a projection is entirely different from it to be a fiction. It can be a projection without being a fiction. So at least on idealism, and that's the kind of view that the Kierkegaardian theology I described is. So that's one point. Now the other point I wanted to make tonight has to do with morality. And remember that Nietzsche is very critical of moral notions. He thinks that these are also projections that human societies make in order to rationalize their behavior in various ways. And he doesn't think that there's anything really out there that corresponds to this. They're simply projections that we make, and he wants to replace it with his own view of the Übermensch, which is related to the eternal return of the same, and also the will to the power in ways that I described last time. So, but in any event, he's very critical of morality. and moral notions like good and evil. Now, let's remember that in the Kierkegaardian view that I described, there's a similar skepticism, or maybe that's a little too strong, but a kind of wariness about moral notions, because, at least in general, remember that the whole problem of moral dilemmas shows that we find ourselves in a predicament. That is, that there are situations, the moral dilemmas I described, we might find ourselves in, we either have actually found ourselves in at times, or we certainly could conceivably do so, where there are moral requirements that we can't satisfy. We're always going to fall short. So that even if we're not morally wrong or blameworthy for being in that situation, we still are violating some moral requirement that binds us. That's what a moral dilemma is. And even if we never find ourselves in that, it's very possible that we can. And so if we happen to go throughout our entire lives and satisfy every moral requirement, that's just a stroke of luck. That's not something that we deliberately did. So there's a kind of wariness about morality that's part of the Kierkegaardian view. But there's an exception. And remember that it's very much part of the Kierkegaardian theology that I described, that God's moral properties with respect to me, for example, whether God shows up for me as something good or something evil or bad, that's going to come down to how I choose to react to what God has done in Christ. So without getting into a lot of the details again, remember that if I choose to respond with the fact that God has become a human being in Christ and suffered and died and then eventually rises from the dead, if I choose to respond to that either with indifference or with outrage, then God is going to be, for me, quite literally, something bad. That's going to be something bad, maybe morally neutral if I'm indifferent, but certainly bad if I'm not. That's going to come down to my decision. And so that I am the ultimate author of God's moral evil with respect to me. If you will, in Nietzschean terms, I project it. Okay, that doesn't mean that it isn't real. That just means that it comes down to me. Or, alternatively, suppose that I choose to respond to what God has done in Jesus Christ. Suppose that I choose to respond to that with gratitude and maybe even happiness. Well, then God is going to show up for me and be for me something that is extremely good. And I am going to be the author of God's moral goodness vis-a-vis or with respect to me. All right, so what does that mean? Well, that means that I project that moral quality of goodness onto divinity because I choose to respond with feelings of gratitude when I reflect on the fact that God has become a human being who suffers with the purpose of causing me to feel sorrow about that. If I choose to respond to that with gratitude, then God is going to be good for me, and I'm going to be the author of God's goodness with response to me. Whereas if I respond to the fact that God has done this to produce sorrow in me, if I respond to that with either indifference or outrage, then God is going to be something bad for me, morally bad, and I'm going to be the author of that moral badness through my own decision-making. So, if you will, I project these moral qualities onto God based on how I choose to respond to the sorrow that God has set about to cause in me through the suffering of this innocent person that he's become. Okay, that doesn't mean that those moral properties aren't real. And there's no moral dilemma because all I have to do to be perfectly good is to conform to that. All I have to do is choose to respond with gratitude to that and live my life in accordance with that. That's the only binding moral requirement of goodness there is when we start looking at the incarnation and the passion and the resurrection. That's it. There isn't any moral dilemma. And so I'm the author of that goodness, and I can choose to conform to it. There's no problem. Yes, I project that onto divinity, but that doesn't mean that it isn't real. So what I want you to hopefully begin to see here is that this Kierkegaardian view that I have been presenting before this Kierkegaardian view is not vulnerable to the Nietzschean, at least two of the Nietzschean critiques that do apply very forcefully to glass and height theology. I'm going to talk about Sprite theology a little more next time when I cover the last 2 points. But I wanted to make these points tonight, and I hope that you can see that that's a very interesting result. So in any event, that's all I wanted to say tonight, and I hope that you enjoy my summer outfit. Let me just take a couple more turns in it, because I find it very comfortable, and it's kind of sexy and cute. And I thank you again, always I thank you so much for joining me and spending a little bit of your time with me. I know sometimes it's a little demanding, but thank you for your patience. And even if you don't like what I have to say, thank you so much for spending time with me and taking time out of your own very busy life to spend a little time with me. So if you like this video, please like it. And if anybody has any comments or questions, I'll try to answer them. But until next time, this is Katje Eckhart, your New Wave Girl, wishing everybody a safe and restful and a peaceful good evening. Thanks again so much for joining me. Bye-bye.